Put your bottom bracket in, take your TIG welder, tack it in, it ain't moving, you're not gonna have a creak.
One thing I say is that the bottom bracket is misunderstood.
It's not the James Webb telescope industry. We're gonna solve the world's problems with a press-fit bottom bracket. It's gonna be cheaper, blah, blah, blah.
Has the bike industry got bottom bracket design wrong? What are the best and worst bottom brackets out there, and are ceramic ones worth the crazy price tag? To find out, myself and Ollie speak to Calvin and Truman from Park Tools, not only bike experts, but legends in their own right. Okay, right guys, we want to talk about bottom brackets. I think we can all agree we're all absolute bike nerds. You guys are very experienced in this department, so I think first thing we should talk about before we dive deep into the subject is what's the point of the bottom bracket and what's it trying to do?
Well, the heart of the question here is how do you most efficiently allow the spindle of the crank to rotate within the frame?
And the bottom bracket's often called the heart of the bike. It really is. It's important, I think, to think of the whole thing as a system, right? Not just this little pipe and not the two little levers you put your feet on, but the whole idea is to take our pistons. Our two legs are just pistons, right? We're bipedal. Our muscles don't turn in circles, so we're taking our bipedal action, turning that, transforming that work into a circle. That's what the bottom bracket's gonna do for us. So
it's gonna help do that without a bunch of resistance and a lot of play and a lot of in trying to reduce wear, and hopefully it doesn't make a whole bunch of noise.
Right, and the flex, the famous flex thing. Flex is sometimes a good thing and sometimes a bad thing. So it has to account for all of that from whenever we've had bikes. Whenever we decided to get rid of the Dandy, the famous adult Strider, right?
So bottom brackets now, people are familiar with them looking something like this. But if we roll back the years in the early development, it was something very different, right?
Well, but it's still still went in a circle.
So this is old, but this isn't the first generation bottom bracket by any stretch. So this one is a cup and cone bearing. So you have, this is a cup, you got your bearing, and the spindle was your cone. And these were adjustable. You could put different ball bearings on there, different greases, and you could yourself or have your mechanic tune your bottom bracket. But before this, I'm not too familiar with going back too much further, but I'm sure at one point you were using like whale fat to help turn your bottom bracket.
So some of the older bikes, this is the famous one piece. We have a little mini one here. The crank spindle goes all the way through. So this is actually an advance in a way. It's the spindle and the crank are one. They're together as one. Then we went to the spindle and crank being different. There's some of the early bikes do have a one piece that goes into a separate arm. It would be an early two-piece bottom bracket. So a one piece, the famous two-piece of modern times, and then the three-piece we just looked at.
So I was going to say people are like familiar with the axle being part of the crank, but to start with, it was part of the bottom bracket.
That's right. That's right. So now they're separate, but now you really have to talk about them as a system, because that's all one piece now. The flex, the joint here, you're not taking that apart, and then you got to take this other arm off here. So you have to think of it as a whole system now.
And as that whole system, it's interesting because we talk about bottom brackets and we lay a lot of blame on bottom brackets, and then there's a lot of nomenclature behind bottom bracket classifications like BB30, BB386, PF30, BSA, T47, all kinds of nomenclatures. But you can't just, you don't walk into the store and say, I need a T47 bottom bracket. You can't do that because it's a system, it's a party, You can't bring your 24 millimeter, friend and have, a 30 millimeter bottom bracket. That's not gonna work out. So it has to work as a whole system. Where originally, BB30, you'd have a 30 millimeter spindle, but now you can run the whole system. You have to think of it as a system. You have to think about, okay, I have a BB30 frame and I have a Shimano crank. I need to match those together. And it's like the bottom bracket has turned into an adapter, and going back to its original purpose, the bearing or the ability to rotate the crank within the frame.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but before all of these different standards, you would go to the bike shop, they'd be trying to build up your bike, and they'd simply look at the frame and go, oh yeah, we've got a bottom bracket that's roughly got that axle width, and kind of get it about right. Whereas now you're defined by lots of different standards, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. We used to have different length spindles and we could move the chain rings out or in to get better chain line. But nowadays, your chain line, it is what it is, right? You got what you got and you're not moving it left to right. So we're trusting more and more in the manufacturers to get things straight. And they're doing a pretty good job. Let's say that. But yeah, you don't have the ability to move stuff around. Your rear sprockets used to be able to move them left and right. Nowadays, nope, they're stuck in that one position.
Which also comes back to a little bit of compatibility, when you're looking and you're ordering the parts. Or if you're working at a manufacturer and you're speccing a bike, you have to know what bottom bracket's going to work with what crank, which is going to have the correct chain line for the drivetrain that you're using on that bike. So it's, a little bit more complex than it used to be.
What would you say is the easiest way for people to find that out? Because it feels like it's a very complicated thing for a lot of people to be able, I think people really struggle with that.
I think you're right.
You got to know what you're starting with, number one. You have to know your standard. You got to take measurements. One way, of course, is to get on the cell phone and the internet and look around. That's why it's nice to have a pro mechanic to turn to trust, that can do that research and know what they're talking about. And if you can get the exact stuff exactly that you had, yes, it's likely to work, right? But it's not exactly like a car repair where you go in and I got the Land Rover, got the '83 Land Rover. Here's my model, and give me the exact carburetor for it.
Yeah.
No, it's much more vague.
But it can be pretty vague, but it can also be a little bit more direct. Like if you go to a manufacturer, say you're going to go to Shimano, and you have your bike has a bottom bracket standard that they agree with. Like say you have BSA or VB92 or something that they sell a bottom bracket for. You can buy their whole kit for that particular spec, and then you're guaranteed to get the right thing right there. But if you're looking for a replacement or an upgrade, that can be a lot harder. Right. So I would call that, the term holistic, group has been thrown around more and more lately. And that's been making things a little bit easier in some ways. But if you're going to go off the beaten path to get something with the least amount of resistance, the fastest turning, the ceramic, then your job gets a little bit more difficult going into the aftermarket. Or if you're trying to solve a creaking issue and you're trying to find a bottom bracket as a solution to that.
I think that gets us on to a big question that a lot of people have. So in your experience as mechanics, what causes bottom brackets to creak?
Movement.
Simply put, when two things move against each other, there can be a noise, right? So if you put your bottom bracket in, take your TIG welder, tack it in, it ain't moving, you're not going to have a creak. But the famous analogy is a cricket rubbing its legs. If you can tie the legs together, or some people, lubrication, you can lubricate some creaks, it actually will still be moving, right? So if there's movement down there and it's lubricated, it'll be quiet. It's still moving. The grease is going to wear out. Eventually, it's going to wash out, and then all of a sudden, you've got a creak again. So the number one thing,
if it's movement, what's causing the movement?
Too loose. Increase that tension. Get a torque wrench and ramp up the tension. Your crank bolt, just plain old. You put the bolt in here and you ran it in tight. Oh, I think I got it tight. And then there's movement here. Tighten that bolt, or if it's the bottom bracket, into the frame, the adapter into the frame, If it's loose at all, it could be moving. Tighten that. So simply being loose is the number one.
Well, there's a lot of interfaces that we're dealing with when we're dealing with some, one thing I say is that the bottom bracket is misunderstood. We often blame the bottom bracket for all creaks. So sometimes we don't have to blame the bottom bracket. It's not its fault. It's just sitting there doing its thing, and it's not actually making the noise, but everybody loves blaming the bottom bracket. So I always like making sure that it is the bottom bracket. Go through the quicker things, easier first. Your through axles, your quick releases, your cassettes, your pedals, your handlebars, the front quick release. There's all kinds of things it could be that's causing this creak that's not your bottom bracket. So it's misunderstood in some ways. But once you get to the bottom bracket, there's a lot of different interfaces that can creak, because you're talking just on one side. Let's say that these fit together, they don't. You've got the spindle to, this is actually a three-piece, you can take this cap off. You've got the spindle to the crank arm. You've got the spindle to the bearing in the bottom bracket. You've got the bearing to the adapter, essentially, the sleeve. And then you have that cup going into the frame. And sometimes I've seen it where, say you have an aluminum sleeve bonded into a carbon bike, you then have that bond right there. That all of those interfaces could have a little bit of movement causing a noise.
Right. Even on the press fit, this is a press fit here, so it's pushing into a frame. And if it's not just the right tolerance, when we put a threaded bottom bracket together, we're counting on the tension of that thread to hold things tight. But here you're squeezing it into a fit. You're squeezing that cup tight, and if it's not tight enough, there could be movement here. And again, the bearing in the cup, so plenty of places to track down. Truman makes a good point about the mimicry of the frame, especially those carbon fiber frames. A noise at the back end, you hear it, it's traveling through this big drum head of a frame to show up other places. So riding with a buddy can help sometimes. You hear this creak, they're getting behind you, beside you, the left side, the right side, another set of ears to triangulate that noise. Let's back up a minute though and talk about the manufacturers trying to make a hole. So you've got this one, nominally 46 millimeters for the press fit, PF 46. And the idea is it's going to be tight. But if they get this a little bit wrong, it cannot be tight enough. If it's too tight, on some bearings, you'll actually feel them turn. If you're a pretty healthy person, you can take these really thin cartridges, squeeze the outside hard, and you can feel there's a little bit of resistance there. Steel flexes, we need to remember that. So the aluminum here, when we press it in, it's going to expand a certain bit and squeeze. But its modulus, its ability to do that and to provide pressure is different than steel. So a steel, an aluminum, and carbon fiber should actually have 3 different tolerances. But the bike industry, it turns out, is not the James Webb telescope industry. We use just one.
Very niche.
We need that. The point is you got to make it up sometime, and that's with better living through chemistry.
Yeah, it's a hard, it's hard to hit the nail on the head in this case, because you're talking, you need it to be tight enough, but not too tight, and then it needs to be darn round.
Goldilocks.
It's got to be perfectly round, because just like we were talking about, if it's too tight and it's compressing that bearing, at least it's compressing consistently around the whole outside, and it's then that load is spread throughout all the bearings as they rotate. Whereas if the hole that they made or molded is not perfectly round, it's ovalized or it has high spots here and there, then you're going to be loading up a couple bearings at a time, and that'll wear your bearings out even quicker than the whole thing being just a little bit tight.
Right.
So there's multiple things that these all have to have right, and it's easier in metal than it is in carbon fiber because they usually would just machine it.
Yeah. So the press fit, if it's bad, we can run what's called a retaining compound. We have an RC1, there's other brands out there. So it's a liquid that goes in there. It does 2 things. expands and hardens. The mild ones expand a little bit and harden a little bit, but the RC1 expands more and hardens more to help hold that bearing. But we're talking about the bottom bracket, but let's back up to the other part of the bicycle, you and your power in your legs. So when we're cranking down on an arm, our mighty quad, we got Ollie here, just wattage, here goes his wattage. You are flexed, yep. Remember, steel, okay, your viewers, now watch carefully here, see if Truman can see this. Did you see? It flexed.
Yeah.
No. Well.
I saw it perfectly.
But when you ride your bike, this is what's fun on these old ones, you can take it out and see a little wear mark here, but not here. And the opposite is over here. It's flex, 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 flex. It's not a loose bearing, it's normal flex. That is still happening here.
And a lot of times, you guys have seen it, yours has some wear signatures on it. This one doesn't. And that flex you can see in the signature of where the bearing has been, it's just been flexing back and forth. You can see this in hubs too.
Yeah, when you ride, that's a normal thing. You get, we have this illusion, I will provide power 360 degrees. Well, that's the fun thing about the data capture from the different torque systems. We don't pedal like that. We are humans. Left, right, left, right, left, right. So we have to account for that. Bottom brackets are going to handle that as best they can, but that does cause some of the issues and some of the wear. So anyway, for the bad press fit, some of that chemistry can help. The famous beer can shim, don't do it, people.
It's got to be really bad too.
Yeah, it's that bad.
Beer cans and bottom brackets don't go well together. But having said about the different tolerances and how that can impact the resistance and notching on a bearing, how can people look at the bearings in terms of reducing drag? Like, do you guys are believers in like premium bottom brackets and the ceramic bearings? Do you think it's worth the hype and the expense, or do you think a good quality setup is just as good?
Depends on who you are.
Yes.
Are you chasing those marginal gains or are you not? So there's a super low resistance bottom bracket set up really well can last a very long time if you have a perfect setup. So let's say you don't have quite that perfect setup. The bottom bracket shell is not perfectly round. It's not the perfect tolerance, and you invest in this nice bottom bracket. You can wear out that bottom bracket prematurely. So it goes back to, yes, that premium bottom bracket can make a big difference, but the setup on the bike has to be perfect, or has to be at least very good to start with. So making sure that the bottom bracket is round, that where it's going to be pressed into is round, and then also flat from side to side, so they're faced properly. And then early on in press fit, what we ran into was one side would be machined, and then you machine the other side. So then they would be different from one another. So now usually you would machine the whole thing all at once, and so they're all the same from one side to the other side.
Yeah. So are they worth it? We talked about marginal gains, and let's flip that coin a second. If you're the retailer and you're the mechanic, yeah, those marginal gains are worth it. You would just upsold a bottom bracket for it was 80 pounds for this one bottom bracket. Now it's 200 for the ceramic teacup bearings. The main purpose of the ceramic bearings, they do have a purpose, but when their design came out, it was for speed. It was for spinning high RPMs. So when Cavendish or who's your track rider? You know, the guy in Manchester, Gold Knight, your Knights.
Was it Wiggins?
Chris Hoy.
Yeah.
I don't know.
How fast are they going? How fast are that going? 120, 140, right? 140 RPM. Is that fast for a bearing? Hello, wake up. So somebody turning me, that's nothing.
Our machine's spinning up to 60,000 RPMs in a matter of seconds.
It needs a ceramic. That's the type of thing that needs that because of the heat. So, okay, do you really need it? No. The nice steel bearing is just fine. But it is quite a marginal gain. If you want to be cheap and do it, take out those rubber seals. Oh yeah, now it's spinning quicker. Sure it is. And wait till you ride that first rainy ride and you get some grit in there.
It's okay though, Calvin, because it never rains in England.
When you want to set the hour record, that's one of the things. It would take the seals out because you don't want that drag. You wouldn't care. And then take the grease out.
Yep.
There's a sheer force in grease. The stickiness of a grease as the bearing comes through that, like mud on a mountain bike. If you put a light grease in there, or even oil, it's less resistance. So those little
For your
things can add up.
For your hill climb race, you want to put your sewing machine oil in there.
Probably not for your winter bike.
Yeah.
And that's where the response, it depends, is key. It depends on, the budget, what your goals are, the conditions you're going to be riding in. There's a lot of things you have to consider. And then how much maintenance do you want to be doing yourself, or how much do you want to be paying for?
The competency of the person putting it in.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing with bottom brackets, really, is that I feel like a lot of the modern standards have moved away from something that's good for people to do at home to really needing so many different complicated tools, and maybe it's more of a job that you have to go to the bike shop for. So it kind of leads on to the question, actually, of like, what would you say is your favourite design and type of bottom bracket?
Well,
I know I put you on the spot. You don't rush to answer.
You can only have one for the rest of your life.
I'll only have one for the rest of my life. I'm gonna be that guy. I'm gonna pick BSA. It just continues to go and work, and pretty darn easy to service. You can take bottom brackets in and out. You can easily machine them. The bottom brackets, at the shop, or if you have access to a lot of funds, you could buy all the tools to do that at your home, and you can chase the threads and make sure that they're perfectly parallel with the other ones on the other side, and you can face the edges. You can make those changes at home easily with fairly accessible tools. I mean, you got to have a couple $1,000s wrapped up in tools if you're going to be making those cutting changes, but it's a pretty standard. Right. And some of the bottom brackets that are out there are very forgiving. So like a Hollowtech 2 bottom bracket, a 105 Hollowtech 2 bottom bracket is very forgiving of some of those tolerances. Exactly.
So I would agree the Birmingham small arms standard, the BSA, is great. I would still make some changes on it.
Yeah. What would you change? Come on. What would you change?
Well, when we back in the day when I was talking to BSA, these fine threaded bottom brackets, the reason they did that is because our bearing adjustment needed to be very, very fine. With a very fine thread, we could make good bearing adjustments. A little bit of 1/8 of a turn, right? So that's 24 TPI, 24, it's pretty much a millimeter. So 1/8 of a turn is 1/8 of a millimeter closer to the bearings. That's our adjustments. That's great. Who's making a bearing adjustment today? The people working on older bikes. This needs to be a coarse thread. If this were a nice coarse thread you're putting in your cartridge bottom brackets, all would be good. Here's an example. That's a coarse thread. It's going to last a lot longer. It doesn't have to be as precise. There's a lot of overlap with the aluminum. So if we went a coarser thread, it would be better. Let's make it bigger, because nowadays the frame makers want a bigger shell to weld their tubes in. So bigger diameter, threaded, but a coarse thread. So to throw a standard under the bus, the T47. 47 millimeters, but a 1 millimeter pitch. No one is making a bearing adjustment. They're just ramming it down tight. This absolutely should have been a coarser thread.
Shots fired.
Wow.
Shots fired for the T47.
I was going to say, I like T47.
Well, yeah. We both agreed that we quite liked T47, but I don't want to admit that now.
Yeah.
That's right, but if it were just the size is good. It's a lot going for it. But when they made this, there was a little group that got together and made this. the thinking was that people were going to convert their old press fits to this. I don't think I know anybody who did that. People just bought a new bike. They didn't need to have that fine pitch. There was no reason for it. They just carried on a bit of legacy, right? They just carried some headache forward for the future, and now it's here. Who wants T47 plus?
Well, T47, I mean, it has a lot going for it.
I was going to say, you guys have pretty much said there's a common theme here. All four of us have said a threaded bottom bracket. I think I'm going to throw it out there. The reason I think we maybe come up with that is because it's probably easier to manufacture and get a tolerance right on an external metal cup than trying to get the tolerance right on a frame. Would you agree or not?
Yes, I think it's easier to go to a tap and die manufacturer, because the people who are making frames, they're going to go to wherever they're making it. Whatever country it is, they're going to go to the local tap and die manufacturer, and they're going to tool up a few cutting tools. And it's easy to go to them and have them hold that standard. And then you use that tool to make your bottom bracket and make them consistent from one to the next. But when you're molding, things get a little bit trickier.
Having said that, this is also a fun story to me in the industry. So this was a press fit. We had the press fit. The industry said, oh, we're going to solve the world's problems with the press fit bottom bracket. It's going to be cheaper, blah, blah, blah. And then they pressed them in and they were complaining because they creaked. There were problems. We're going to solve that problems by introducing threads. Here's a brilliant idea. It's now a threaded bottom bracket. So they took out the threads, but with these that thread together, we called them thread through or thread together bottom brackets. You put one on one side, come on there. Press it in, you push this one in, tighten it down, so effectively you are threaded again. A good workaround, a good...
I thought it was an interesting sort of design feature where someone's gone, well, press fit's cool, but we kind of still quite think threads are good as well, so maybe we'll put them together.
That's right, so now, I guess it's the best of both worlds, but you really got threads again, so yeah. Kind of the same thing.
You have threads again, but you have like half of the benefit of threads.
Right.
So, yeah, you're still kind of at the bay of the tolerance of the frame, because you're now, all of your pressure is this way, pushing on the faces. Mm-hmm. If there's too much slop in the tolerance this way, there's still going to be movement there or potential movement there. Right. So where when you have the threads and you have, a peak in a valley interfacing with another peak in a valley, it's centering itself in that hole, in that bore, and then it's creating pressure on all those threads. So it's really putting a lot of pressure, holding it exactly in place. So I think press fit, I think it has a bad rap. I think that maybe the bicycling industry and bicycles maybe weren't the perfect spot for it, and bottom brackets on it, because headset, we don't have that many issues with, right? And those are all press fit, most of them. Some of them are inset. But when you're talking about like back to the lathes and the machines here in the back, the bearings are press fit in there. Most of the bearings are press fit into those machines. And they use bearing, and if it's a big enough bearing, they're not press fit. They're a loose fit. And then they use bearing retainer on those. And we're talking bearings, big bearings. So it's very much, it can be done. It's just the bicycle industry, it's hard for us because we want to be lightweight, not a ton of material. You want to be fast and you want to be able to service it. So it's just different. Press fit, good. In bikes, in the bottom bracket specifically, not that great.
I think that's like a really interesting point to maybe sort of like end on with bottom brackets, because we could be here for hours, but I think, I like that. Press fit can really work for the bike industry, but you've got lesser margin for those tolerances, so it makes it a lot tougher, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just think one of the most satisfying things in the world, right, is when you put in your chain set and you've not got a chain on and you spin it and it just goes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Well, and that's the result of a good tolerance on a bottom bracket, right?
That's right. But I want to leave just be a fly in the ointment. Now remember, it's spinning without any resistance. When you put your legs on that, even a human power, the resistance is different from your flexing.
Yeah.
Could be it's a little bit of an illusion that it spins so free.
Okay.
Oh, always a fly in the ointment.
Yeah. Guys, it's mega to talk bottom brackets with you guys. I hope everyone at home's enjoyed it as well.